We ask you to sit with this one a while because it begins the way so many hard, true things begin, quietly and with almost nothing. She was 41 years old and she owned exactly $9.40, a trunk of clothes too fine for the work she now needed, and a grief she had not yet found the bottom of. Her name was Iris Calloway, and 3 months earlier her husband's brother, a hard, calculating man named Dunstan Calloway, had ridden onto the small parcel of land she and her husband Thomas had worked for 12 years, produced a paper she had never seen and could not read well enough to argue against, and told her the land was his now, by right of blood and by the law of a territory that did not much trouble itself over the rights of widows. She had been given 2 days to leave. She left with what she could carry, and so it was that on a gray autumn morning in the town of Marrow Hollow, in the Nebraska Territory, in the year 1886, a woman who had once kept a household of linens and silver stood at the edge of a dusty auction yard and spent $6, nearly 2/3 of everything she owned in this world, on a broken-down, sun-bleached wagon that had belonged to a dead man nobody in town wanted to speak of. It was, by any sane measure, a foolish purchase. The wheels were split. The boards were gray with age. And yet something in her, some old stubborn instinct her father had called the seeing eye, told her to bid on it anyway, when every other soul in that yard had turned their backs on it as junk. She could not have known, running her hand along its splintered rail that morning, that sealed inside that wagon's very bones was a secret that would not only save her own life, but restore a broken town to something it had not been in 11 long years. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Iris Calloway. If you have ever found yourself starting over with almost nothing but your own 2 hands, tell us where you're watching from tonight. We have a feeling this one is for you. Iris had not always been a woman who counted coins. She had been raised the daughter of a cooper in a river town in Ohio, a man named Samuel Whitfield who built barrels so tight and so true that steamboat captains would wait an extra week in port just to carry his work downriver. From her father, Iris had learned 2 things that would shape the whole of her life, though she did not know it then. She had learned to look at a broken, discarded thing and see not what it was, but what it had been made to be, and she had learned patience, the long, unglamorous patience of a craftsman who understands that good work reveals itself slowly, plank by plank, stave by stave. Her mother had died when Iris was 9, and so it had fallen to her, the eldest of 3, to run the household, to keep the ledger of what flour and lamp oil the family could afford, to nurse her younger brothers through fevers with cool cloths and quiet, steady humming. She grew up believing that a woman's worth was measured not in what she was given, but in what she could make endure. When she was 22, she had married Thomas Calloway, a gentle, sturdy man with sun-browned hands and a laugh that came easily, and together they had gone west, chasing the promise of land that so many families chased in those years, not gold, not glory, just soil of their own and a roof that no landlord could take from them. They had built a life on 80 acres outside Marrow Hollow, a modest but proud homestead, and though children had never come to them, they had filled that emptiness with work and with each other, with the particular tenderness of 2 people who had chosen one another and meant it. Thomas had admired his wife's steady hands and her father's old lessons. He used to say that Iris could look at a busted chair and see a whole new life for it, before he'd even finish cursing at it. She had mended harnesses, reupholstered furniture bought for pennies at estate sales, restored an old clock that the previous owners had thrown out for scrap, and in each case, the thing she had rescued had gone on to serve a purpose far beyond what anyone expected of it. It was, she would later say, the only inheritance her father had truly left her. Not money, but the eye. The eye to see value where others saw only waste. And though she did not know it yet, standing in that auction yard 11 years after her father's death, that same eye was about to change everything. The fall came the way falls so often do, not all at once. Like a cliff but in a slow, sickening slide, like a wagon losing its wheel on a grade. Thomas had died in the spring of 1886, thrown from a young horse he was gentling, his neck broken before Iris could even reach him across the field. She had buried him herself, with the help of 2 neighbor women, because in the raw days after, she found she could not bear the thought of strangers' hands lowering him into the ground. Grief alone might have been survivable. Grief and a hostile brother-in-law were not. Dunstan Calloway had never liked Iris. He had thought his brother a fool for marrying a cooper's daughter with no family fortune behind her. And when Thomas died without a will that anyone could produce, Dunstan had seen his opportunity and taken it with both hands. He rode out from the county seat with a lawyer's letter full of words Iris did not fully understand. Words about next of kin and improved title, and the deceased's rightful heir. And though every fiber of her being told her the claim was built on sand, she had no money for a lawyer of her own, no family in the territory to stand behind her, and no husband left to defend what they had built together. The local judge, a tired, overworked man named Harmon Reeve, who saw 40 such disputes a season, and had long since stopped looking closely at any of them, signed the order in less time than it takes to boil coffee. Iris was given 2 days. She sold what furniture she could to neighbors too poor to pay her fair value for it, packed her father's old cooper's tools and her mother's Bible into a trunk, and walked into Marrow Hollow with that trunk on a borrowed handcart, and $9.40 sewn into the hem of her petticoat. Because even in the depths of her sorrow she had not forgotten her father's oldest lesson: never let anyone see exactly what you have. She took a small room above the mercantile, paid for by the week, and she understood, lying awake that first night listening to the wind rattle the shutters, that she had perhaps 3, maybe 4 weeks before her money ran out entirely, and she would have nothing at all. It was in her second week in town, wandering the edge of the county auction, a monthly gathering where farms behind on their debts, and estates with no heirs to claim them, had their goods sold off to the highest bidder, that she came upon the wagon. It sat apart from the other lots, half hidden behind a stack of broken fence rail, and the auctioneer, a brisk man named Pruitt, moved through it so quickly in his patter that Iris almost missed it entirely. "Wagon, condition poor, formerly belonging to the estate of Elias Thorne," he called out, barely pausing. "Sold as is, no warranty," and a ripple of low, uneasy laughter went through the small crowd. Iris asked the woman beside her, an older farm wife with flour still dusted on her apron, why the mention of the name had drawn such a reaction, and the woman had lowered her voice as though the dead man himself might overhear. Elias Thorne, she explained, had been the town's wainwright and wheelwright for near 20 years. A solitary, close-mouthed man who had never married, and who had died alone in his workshop 11 years past, found 3 days after, the story went, by a boy delivering milk. But it was not simply his death that made folks uneasy. It was what had happened just before it. In the last year of his life, Thorne had been entrusted, as a respected tradesman and one of the few men in town who could read and cipher well, with a portion of funds the town had raised, nearly $400, an enormous sum for a place like Marrow Hollow, to build a proper schoolhouse and dig a second town well, the first having gone foul with fever 2 summers running. And when Thorne died, the money was nowhere to be found. No ledger, no banknote, no sign of where it had gone. The town's leading citizen at the time, a banker named Corwin Ashford, had led the search himself, had gone through Thorne's workshop and papers with what everyone agreed was admirable thoroughness, and had come back grim-faced to declare that the wainwright must have gambled the funds away, or hidden them for himself and died before he could spend them, or simply been swindled by some traveling grifter. No one could say for certain, only that the money was gone, and so in the town's memory was Elias Thorne's good name. The school was never built. The second well was never dug. And when the fever came again 3 years later and took 11 souls, including 3 children, a good portion of Marrow Hollow quietly, bitterly laid that at Thorne's door as well, though he had been 6 years in his grave by then. It was, the farm wife said, shaking her head, a sad old story. And no one wanted his things, not his tools, not his workshop, and certainly not this last wagon. sitting unclaimed and unsold for over a decade in the corner of a livery yard until the county finally decided to be rid of it. Iris looked at that wagon a long moment. She saw the split wheel, the gray wood, the tongue cracked near the yoke. And she also saw, because she had her father's eye, and because some things a craftsman's daughter simply cannot help but notice, that the wagon had been built with a care and precision far beyond ordinary utility, that its joints were dovetailed where lesser wagons were merely nailed, that whoever made it had loved his work. When Pruitt called for bids and the yard stayed silent, embarrassed almost, Iris heard her own voice before she had quite decided to speak, offering $2. An awkward silence. Then, because no one else moved, Pruitt brought his gavel down at $6 after a token counterbid from a man who clearly only wanted the scrap iron. And just like that, Iris Calloway owned a dead man's wagon, and the whispers followed her the whole way as she and a hired boy pushed and dragged it back to the small shed behind her, boarding house that the landlord let her use for a nickel a week. She did not go looking for secrets that first evening. She went looking simply for a way to make $6 worth of foolishness into something worth more than she had paid, perhaps firewood, if nothing else, though even then some part of her flinched at the thought of breaking apart work so carefully made. She began, as her father had taught her, at the joints, testing each one for soundness, running her palm along the grain to feel for rot or worm. It was in doing this, kneeling in the lamplit shed with the autumn cold creeping through the shed's gaps, that her fingers found something wrong beneath the driver's bench. Not rot, not damage, but a seam that should not have been there. A strip of wood along the underside of the seat box that did not match the grain running the rest of the length, fitted with a precision that again spoke of Thorne's careful hand. She worked at it with the edge of her father's old cooper's knife, gently, the way she would have worked a stubborn barrel stave, and after some minutes the panel came free with a soft, dry sigh as though it had been waiting 11 years to exhale. Inside the hollow space beneath it lay a bundle of oilcloth, tied with waxed cord gone brittle with age, and when Iris unwound it with trembling hands, she found a stack of folded papers, yellowed but dry, protected all these years from rain and rot by Thorne's own careful hand. She sat back on her heels in that cold shed and understood, with a chill that had nothing to do with the weather, that she was holding something no one had seen in 11 years, and that the dead man everyone in Marrow Hollow believed a thief had built himself a hiding place inside his own wagon, with the same devotion he'd built everything else. The papers were letters, a dozen of them, unsent, unfinished in places, some crossed out and begun again in a small, careful, deliberate hand. And as Iris read them by lamplight long into that first night, forgetting entirely to eat the bread she'd bought for supper, the story of Elias Thorne unfolded itself before her like a bolt of cloth. The earliest letters were addressed to no one in particular, more like a private accounting a man keeps with his own conscience, and they spoke of Thorne's growing unease with Corwin Ashford, the town's banker, who had approached him some 8 months before his death, with a proposal that Thorne clearly found distasteful, even as he felt unable, given Ashford's standing, to refuse outright. Ashford, it seemed, had convinced the town council to route the school and well funds through Thorne, rather than through the bank itself, on the reasoning that a tradesman's workshop, being modest, would draw less notice from the road agents who had been troubling the territory that year. A reasonable-sounding argument, but one that Thorne, in his letters, noted with growing suspicion, had also conveniently placed the money entirely outside Ashford's own bank ledgers, where it could not be traced or questioned. A later letter, dated some 5 months before his death, was more troubled still. Thorne wrote that he had discovered, quite by accident, that Ashford was deeply indebted himself, having made a series of poor investments in a rail spur that had never been built, and that he now suspected, though he had no proof he dared commit fully to paper, that Ashford intended to have him, Thorne, take the blame should the town funds ever go missing, precisely because Thorne was a solitary man with no family to defend his name after the fact. The final letters, written in the last weeks of his life, were the ones that struck Iris hardest, because they were not addressed to the town, or to Ashford, or to no one. They were addressed, each of them, to a young woman named Constance, whom Thorne referred to with an aching, restrained tenderness as though every word cost him something. Iris understood, piecing it together, that Constance had been Thorne's intended, a schoolteacher from the county seat whom he had courted quietly for 2 years, and that he had been saving, in secret, for a home and a wedding, ashamed all the while of his more visible poverty next to men like Ashford who courted the same social circles. In his last letter, unfinished and never sent, dated only 4 days before the milk boy found him, Thorne wrote that he had hidden the town's funds inside the wagon's seat box, not out of theft but out of fear. Fear that Ashford meant to force his hand or ruin him regardless of what he did, and that he intended, the letter said, to go to Judge Reeves' predecessor the following week with everything he knew, proof and all, and clear both his conscience and his name before he asked for Constance's hand. He never got the chance. And in the 11 years since, the town had buried an innocent man's reputation beside his body, while the man who had truly betrayed them sat on the town council still, respected, prosperous, his own debts long since quietly settled, Iris would come to learn, by nothing other than the interest accrued, year upon year, on funds that had never been his to keep in the first place, funds diverted so cleverly that no ledger anywhere named him a thief. Iris did not sleep at all that night. She sat with those letters spread before her like the pieces of a life someone else had been forced to leave unfinished, and she felt something rise in her that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but some fierce, quiet cousin of both, the same feeling, perhaps, that had once made her father refuse to sell a poorly made barrel, even when a customer offered good money for it, because he could not bear to let shoddy work pass as honest. She understood 2 things with total clarity as the lamp guttered low. The first was that beneath the seat box's second, deeper compartment, for she had found, working further into the night, that Thorne's careful hands had built not one hiding place but 2. Nested like a puzzle box, lay a small iron strongbox, and inside it, wrapped again in oilcloth, the town's missing $400, untouched, uncounted these 11 years, along with a ledger in Thorne's own hand documenting every dollar of it, and, more damning still, several receipts and a letter from a railspur investment firm addressed not to Thorne, but to Corwin Ashford, which Thorne must have found and kept as evidence of exactly the debts he feared would be his undoing. The second thing Iris understood was that she now held in her 2 hands both the power to save herself from ruin and the power to unmake a man who had let an innocent town blame the dead for his own sins, and that these 2 things, whatever her circumstances, could not be pursued in the same breath, not honestly, not by a woman who had been raised by a man who believed a thing done well was worth more than a thing done fast. She might have kept it. We will not pretend to you that the thought did not cross her mind. In the rawest hours of that long night, with $9.40 standing between her and the winter, $400 would have bought her a small piece of land, a fresh start far from Dunstan Calloway's reach, a life free of the boarding house and its counted weeks. No one alive knew that Strongbox existed. No one would ever have known. But Iris sat with her father's cooper knife still in her hand, and she thought of Thomas and of her father, and of a schoolteacher named Constance who had likely spent years wondering what had become of the quiet man who loved her. And she found, in the end, that she simply could not do it. Not because the law would catch her, for it would not have, but because some things a person carries inside them cannot be unbuilt once you understand what they're for, any more than a barrel can be unmade back into staves once it's held its first rainwater. She decided, before the sun rose over Marrow Hollow, that she would see this through properly. But she also understood, with a clear and sober practicality that was every bit as much a part of her as her conscience, that walking into town alone and announcing she'd found the missing funds, with Corwin Ashford still sitting on the council, and Judge Reeves still on the bench, was as likely to see her run out of Marrow Hollow as a schemer as it was to see justice done. She would need to be careful. She would need proof laid out so plainly that no one, not Ashford, not the council, not the town gossips who had already marked her as the fool who bought a dead man's wagon, could twist the truth of it. It took her the better part of 2 weeks to build her case, and in that time she told no one what she had found, not even the kindly boarding house keeper, Mrs. Odell, who had begun to fret over how little Iris seemed to eat and how late her lamp burned each night. Iris worked instead like the craftswoman she was, methodically, one joint at a time. She copied Thorne's ledger figures onto a fresh sheet in her own hand, cross-referencing each dollar amount against the town's own public accounting of the original fundraising, which she found, after some persistence, was still on record at the county courthouse, dusty and unread for a decade. She matched the dates on Ashford's Railspur investment letter against the dates in Thorne's private letters, and found them aligning with an ugly, unmistakable precision. She sought out discreetly an elderly former council clerk named Josiah Purnell, a man long retired and largely ignored by the town's current leadership, who remembered the fund drive well and who, when shown carefully, and only in part, the original town ledger page, confirmed without prompting that the figures had never sat right with him at the time, though he'd been too junior a man in those days to say so aloud against a banker's word. And she wrote in her own careful hand, copying the very habits her father had taught her for keeping honest books. A full accounting of what she had found, where, and how it corroborated both the missing funds and the reason Elias Thorne had never been able to speak in his own defense. Only then, with her evidence assembled as tightly and truly as any barrel her father had ever built, did she go to the one person in Marrow Hollow she judged might actually listen. Not Judge Reeve, whom she did not yet trust, but the town's new young circuit-riding minister, Reverend Asa Whitcomb, who had arrived only that spring and who had, in his few months there, already earned a reputation for visiting the poorest households in town without being asked and for refusing, pointedly, several dinner invitations from Corwin Ashford's table. It did not go easily, of course, and we would be doing this story a disservice if we told you it did. Word travels fast in small towns, and it was not 2 days after Iris first laid her findings before Reverend Whitcomb that Corwin Ashford himself appeared at the boarding house, immaculately dressed, his voice smooth as poured cream, offering Iris a reasonable settlement for the wagon and its contents. A full $25, more money than she had touched in months, in exchange for what he called, with a thin smile, putting this unfortunate old business to rest, for everyone's sake. When Iris declined, gently but without wavering, his tone cooled considerably, and within the week she found herself the subject of a fresh round of whispers, this time seeded, she was fairly certain, by Ashford's own circle, that the widow Calloway was a schemer, that she'd likely forged whatever papers she claimed to have found, that a woman with no family and a wagon nobody wanted had no business making accusations against one of the town's most respected men. Mrs. Odell, to her credit, never once wavered in her kindness, but Iris noticed the mercantile owner grow curt with her, noticed 2 women who had been friendly enough at church cross the street rather than greet her, and she understood that Ashford, whatever else he was not a man who yielded ground easily. Judge Reeve, when Reverend Whitcomb finally brought the matter formally before him, was reluctant at first even to hear it, muttering about old business better left buried and about the impropriety of reopening a closed estate matter on the word of a newcomer, until Whitcomb, with a steadiness Iris would be grateful for the rest of her days, laid the ledger, the letters, and old Josiah Purnell's corroborating testimony on the judge's own desk, and asked him plainly whether he was prepared to let an innocent dead man's name go on carrying the town's shame, while a living man who had, by their own evidence, misdirected town funds for his personal debts continued to sit on the council that governed them all. The reckoning, when it came quietly, in the way that true justice in a small frontier town so often did, not with gunfire or grand courtroom drama, but with a special hearing called before the full council on a cold Thursday evening in early winter. The schoolhouse, the very one never built with Thorne's diverted funds, so that the meeting was held instead in the drafty back room of the Mercantile, packed with more townsfolk than anyone could recall attending a council matter in years. Iris stood before them, plainly dressed, her hands steady though her heart hammered, and she did not accuse. She simply told the story as the evidence itself told it, letting Thorne's own careful letters speak in his own defense at last, letting the ledger figures and the rail spur correspondence lay themselves side by side for anyone with eyes to see. Corwin Ashford, given his chance to answer, flustered at first, then grew cold, then finally, confronted with Josiah Purnell's plain-spoken recollection, and a date-by-date accounting he could not refute, fell into a silence that was, in its own way, more damning than any confession. He was removed from the council that same night by unanimous vote, and though the county's laws of that era offered little in the way of criminal punishment for a decade-old wrong so carefully obscured, the town's judgment proved its own kind of sentence. Within a year, Ashford's bank lost the confidence of nearly every depositor in Marrow Hollow, and he and his family quietly removed themselves to another territory altogether, leaving behind a name that would, for the rest of that generation, be spoken with the particular cold contempt reserved for a man who let a good and innocent man's memory rot to protect his own comfort. Iris, for her part, wanted no part of the $400 for herself. She said as much plainly, before the whole gathered council, that the money had never been hers to claim and never would be, and instead she asked only that it be put at last to the purpose Elias Thorne himself had died trying to protect. The schoolhouse was finally built the following spring, on a rise of land at the edge of town, and the second well was dug that same summer, deep and clean, so that when the fever came again some years later, as fevers sometimes still did, it found fewer doors to enter through. The town, in its gratitude and its shame both, voted to name the schoolhouse the Thorne School, and had a modest stone marker placed near its door bearing Elias Thorne's name and the words, "Simple and long overdue, a man of his word, Reverend Whitcomb." With some quiet effort, even traced word of Constance, the schoolteacher Thorne had loved, and though she had long since married elsewhere and built a life of her own, she wrote back a letter of her own, thanking the town for restoring to her memory a man she had wondered about for 11 years, and asking only that a single wildflower be planted each spring beside that stone marker in his name. A request the town has honored, we're told, every year since, and so we return, as we always do, to where we began, to a woman standing in an auction yard on a gray autumn morning, believing herself to be making the most foolish purchase of a very hard year. Iris Calloway did not set out to uncover a wronged man's secret, or to bring down a banker's careful lies. She set out only to survive, the way her father had taught her to survive, by looking at what others had thrown away and asking quietly whether it might still hold something worth saving. What she found inside that dead man's wagon was never simply money, though the money mattered, and it was never simply proof, though the proof mattered too. What she found, in truth, was the same lesson her father had given her over a cooper's bench 30 years before. That value is so often hidden, not because it isn't there, but because no one has taken the time or had the patience or possessed the particular tenderness required to look closely enough to see it. Elias Thorne built his last best work not into a wagon at all, but into a hope. The hope that someday someone with the eye to see it would set his name right and finish what he could not. Iris Calloway, cast out with $9 and a father's old knife, turned out to be exactly that someone, and Marrow Hollow, a town that had spent 11 years quietly ashamed of a dead man's memory, became, because of her, a town with a school and a well and a story it could finally tell its children with pride instead of shame. Thank you for spending this time with us tonight, and for letting Iris Calloway's story sit with you a while, the way all good, patient things deserve to sit. If this story moved you, we'd be so grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need it today. and we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell us about a time you found real value in something the world had already written off, whether it was an old object, a forgotten place, or perhaps even a person others had stopped believing in. We read every one of them, and we're always glad to have you here with us. Until next time, stay close.